I'm Doug, your tech support representative for Atlantic British, and in this video we're going to address something that shows up quite a bit, that I find anyway, on the LR3s and the Sports, and that's front wheel bearing failure. Now, you can replace the front wheel bearings on these by themselves. I know there are some areas that you can get them, but generally when you try to press the old bearings out and press the new ones in, some damage is done to the new ones. It's always better to just replace the hub assembly. It also makes it a much easier installation. Now, the first way to find out, do I actually have a bad wheel bearing or not? You hear growling noises from the front end. You can hear a loud brake squeal on corners, and what that is from excessive movement. Now, you want to verify that. You jack your vehicle up. You can either jack up by the frame, or if you're dealing with a floor jack, slide that under the lower control arm, get the front wheel off the ground. You'll notice you have some loose side-to-side play, which can be confused with loose front end part. So then you grab top and bottom, and when you can see that kind of play, you know the wheel bearing is gone. So what you would do, you're going to replace it with this hub assembly. We do stock these, and part number is LR014147, and what you'll get is the complete hub assembly with the bearing, with the new hub, and a new axle retainer nut, which you always want to replace these anytime you take the old one off. So we're going to take the front wheel off. We'll show you how to disassemble the brakes and then how to remove that hub. Alright, so we have the wheel off. We've got this set up so that we can pivot the front wheel. Okay, because you're going to need to do that once we get to the point where we're going to be removing the hub, because we're going to work both sides to remove it. So at this point we have a bolt right here, 10mm head. This supports the hose, the wheel speed wiring, and the brake pad sensor wiring. The reason we're going to take this off is that once we remove the caliper and hang it, we're not going to worry about tearing or pulling any of the wires off. So we're going to zip that out, and then you have two bolts in the back, which are 21mm 12-point bolts. Keep that in mind. You are going to need a 12-point socket to remove those. Alright, so we're going to remove this, take the caliper off. Once we unbolt the caliper, you can twist with the back pulling up a little bit, which will cause the pads to collapse a little bit, and then we can hang it up on the side. Okay, so now we've removed the caliper. We got it hanging up here. I use these Hess hooks that I love for hanging stuff up and out of the way. Now, next step is going to be removal of the wheel speed sensor. You don't have to remove this to take this apart, but it is better, because what's going to happen is once you take these back bolts out for the hub, we're going to be hammering out the hub. One wrong swing with the hammer and you're going to be taking out a sensor. So it's best to take the few extra minutes. We'll take the sensor out of the hub, swing it out of the way, no damage done. Next step is wheel speed sensors now out of the way. We're going to remove this lock bolt right here that holds the rotor in place. That's got a number 50 Torx, and you can use either the security type or the non-security. Both will fit. And we tap that out of there, and then the rotor will we'll basically break it loose by hitting it with a hammer right on the hub area, break it loose, and that should come right off. Alright, so now we have the rotor off. Next we're going to be removing the center nut that holds the axle in place. It's a 32mm. If you notice from the factory, they put a crimp in there right where the keyway is, and that's going to lock it in place. Now we're going to knock that out a little bit so that it does minimal damage to the threads as we take it out of the axle. I use what's called a diamond point chisel, which just basically has more of a square end to it, and sort of just drive it in right into the keyway. So now that's kind of opened up and away from that. Now here's a good confirmation you have a bad wheel bearing when you can take the hub and get that much loose play out of it. There should be no play whatsoever. And it's going to be doing this as you're going down the road, which is definitely not a safe situation. Okay, so we'll take that nut out, and then we're going to access this 4 15mm bolts. That bolt from the back side to hold the hub on. We're going to zip those 4 off, and then comes the fun part. We get to hammer the hub off the vehicle. Alright, so I've zipped off the 4 bolts in the back, and these are what holds the hub assembly on. And you'll notice they're all the same length. You will notice when you put it together, the bottoms will stick out past the hub a little bit further than the uppers. Don't worry about that. That's fine. That's the way they come from the factory. So you'll find access to them is sometimes easier by moving this back and forth. If you find you're having a hard time swinging it like this, you can go around the other side, use the tire on the other side, gives you more leverage, you'll be able to move it easier. Take those bolts out. Now essentially the hub it's an almost press fit. And there's several different ways that you can remove it. All basically end up with the same end result. Push that axle in a little bit. You'll see it loosens up after a few taps. You can either attach a slide hammer mechanism on it and pull it out that way. You could use an air chisel and sneak in from the back side, or you can get yourself some good exercise and you're going to hit it off with a large hammer. Now you're going to find that in some cases it will get cocked to the point where you can't move it anymore. Now you can see that you really can't hit it from the back side, but even just hitting it from this side, which will pull this out, you don't have to worry about damaging the hub. You're replacing it anyway. So you'll end up with a whole new assembly, and the new assembly does not have to be hammered back on. You're going to draw it in with the bolts when you put it back in. So we're going to take a few swings and we're going to knock that out of there. And maybe more than a few swings. Alright, so now we have basically the end result. We have the old hub out. As you can see, definitely way too much play, a lot of rust buildup. They do deteriorate, and as I said, for some reason on the Sport and the LR3, these do become a regular maintenance item. I've replaced an awful lot of them, so you can even hear how dry that bearing is. So you'll notice before you go to slide the new one on that the two bottom holes are spaced further apart than the uppers, so that when you install the new one, you're going to install it in the right position. And essentially you're going to use the bolts to line it up. And instead of hammering on the new hub to install it in place, what essentially you're going to do is you're going to tighten the bolts in a rotating sequence. Especially if you're doing this by hand. If you're using an air tool, you can draw it in a little tighter. But if you're doing it by hand, you're going to work your way around all four bolts and then just very slowly draw this in. So you're going to basically get it on the axle and close enough where you can get to the bolts. You're going to notice that this new bearing is going to turn quite a bit harder than the one you took off. You just slide it in enough where you want to get these bolts started by a couple threads. Do all four of them before you tighten any of them up. This way you know with all four started, when you continue you're not going to be misaligned on the threads. Okay, so we have all four started. So we're going to draw these in and get the new hub in place. Hub is in place. You're going to make sure you look at all 4 points, make sure that hub is drawn in all the way and making full contact with the knuckle assembly in the back. All 4 bolts good and tight. And so now we've got the axle poking through. We're going to put our nut. Now every once in a while you're going to find you're going to need to play with this a little bit sometimes, because even with the crimp pushed out of the way, some minor damage is usually done. So if you're having a real hard time, like in this case, looks like I might have a burr on there. Oh, there we go. Got it started. If it's to the point you just can't get that nut started, you may need to pop the hub back off so that you can check the threads on the end of the axle. Might even be better if you're going to watch through this video first before you do the job. Before you put the hub back on, check the threads on the end of the axle. If you have one crushed over, you can just file it open and install the nut without any problems. Okay, so nuts on secure. There's our keyway like we had earlier. Now we're just going to take that same chisel that we used to open up the nut earlier. We'll tap that down and put a crimp in there, and then that acts as a backup just to keep that nut from backing off. And that's all you really need. So in a nutshell, what you're going to do now is you're going to install your rotor and your set screw to hold it in place. You're going to reinstall your wheel speed sensor. Now if you look on the face of the area where the wheel speed sensor sits, you have some corrosion buildup on there. You really don't want that, because what that can do is affect the air gap of the sensor to the tone wheel inside. So we're just going to get that, pop that scale off. We'll clean it up a little bit with the wire brush. And rub some of the excess off so it goes in there a little bit easier. And just gently tap in place, because this will swing around, so if you're not lined up dead with the hole, this can be swung right or left to get it in place. Take our little bolt. And that's an 8mm on there, by the way. Doesn't have to be super tight. Put it in with a 1/4-inch drive ratchet, and just good and snug. Now you may also want, if you have some around, like some Never Seas or some silicone dry lube, and run it around the outside of this, because after a period of time on these Land Rovers, the rotor can actually freeze on the hub. You'll have a real hard time getting it off. Also makes it easier too. Put a little bit on the outside edge before you install your wheel, and that will in turn make it easier. God forbid, next time you have to take your wheels off, they're going to come off a lot easier. They do have a tendency to lock on. Now for this nut, I back my impact gun down to its lowest setting, number 1. This doesn't have to be super tight. You want it snug. Hook and lift. Now when you put the caliper back in, you set the bolt in the hole, and you can wiggle the caliper around. You'll feel the bolt when it gets lined up, it'll drop right in. You feel it drop in the hole a little bit, and then you just start threading. Okay, we got both of those started. Okay, again, 21mm, 12 point. You won't be able to put a 6 point on these bolts just by the way they're configured. Alright, so this is your wheel speed or your brake pad sensor right here. You'll notice this little rubber and this cupped. You'll set that over and actually push it right down on the bleeder screw, and then your little retainer cap will kind of hold that in place and keeps it down from rubbing on the back of the wheel. And then you don't want to forget your little bracket here. This will keep all your cables and hoses away. Okay, so caliper's mounted, bracket's back in place. Make sure your hoses are back in all their little retainers. You have a small yellow retainer usually on the brake hose to hold one of the cables in place. Your pad sensor is in place. Caliper's tight, nuts been crimped. Retainer screw for the rotor in place. Now you're just going to put the wheel on. One last thing to take note, because you have pushed the pads in to remove them off the rotor, when you first get in, your pedal is going to be rather low. Before you move the vehicle, start it up, pump the pedal a few times, get your brake pedal back up, and then you're good to go. So again, this is how you're going to replace the hub assembly on the front of your LR3 or your Sport. When you're ready to do so, give a call to any of our knowledgeable salesmen at 1-800-533-2210, and thanks for watching.